Hello, everyone, and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. We are in the middle of doing some debug interface code. And really what I wanted to talk about today is we haven't done anything in our game, and honestly, we probably, for the most part, won't ever have to do anything in the game because of its nature as a game that deals with the concept of sort of focus or UI interactions. And the reason for that is because this is an action game, and as a result, I want the game to be very direct control. So I don't want a lot of modality. I don't want a lot of things in the game that are going to be about the sorts of stuff that happens in typical UX design sorts of situations. I want you to be wired directly into the character, and off you go. So we don't really have much that we're ever probably going to do in the game that will involve this sort of thinking. But I wanted to take the opportunity here in the debug system to introduce this aspect of the thinking because the debug system itself does have some modality of operation to it that we can use to sort of discuss these issues which are relevant in general UI programming. And by that, I specifically mean stuff like, I'm moving the mouse around and, I click on a thing and release, and that toggles like a Boolean value, button. It's like a radio button, like on or off or something like this, or a checkbox, right? But if I hold down on that thing and drag, maybe I tear off that thing and I can move it to a different place on the screen or something, right? I'm making this up. But the point is, you can see that there's sort of an interaction model there where things are not hardwired. The act of clicking doesn't do only one specific thing. The act of clicking initiates a potential series of actions, and what the user does subsequent to the click will determine what actually happens with the UI element with which they are interacting. In games, typically in an action game, those things play out over time as a consequence of interacting objects. I punch the barrel and it explodes, which sends a thing flying or whatever, right? That is the consequence of a series of physically of game code triggering events and so on that are outside of the user's input in that way. Whereas in UI coding, it tends to be inside the user's input model, meaning they are controlling that series of events, and only by looking at what the user did can the system understand what was actually trying to happen. So what I wanted to do is, again, just take a little bit of time, since it's not something that we'll ever cover in Handmade Hero later on, to cover that now, because I think it is an important programming topic, and I wanted to just say a few words about it. So let me go ahead first and motivate this just by pointing out where we are at. So if I run things here, you can see that we kind of had a situation where we started making a little bit of a debug output thing here. And some of these things, these debug output things, are stuff I can expand or collapse like this, right? And we haven't done anything particularly fancy, certainly, but that's where we were at. And some of these things even were different kinds. So there was a 50 of value, and we wanted to make something where we could start interacting with that value. And where we left it, if I click on this, right, it just goes to an assertion here because we haven't implemented any way to interact with those. Because all we had was stuff where you could interact with by a click. Either it could negate a Boolean, or it could expand a tree view element of a group. But if it was any other kind of item that might have a value range to it, we didn't really have any way of interacting with that thing. And so if the reason for that, of course, right, is because we haven't talked about at all about how we might do user processing or any of that sort of stuff. So all we just had was just the click, and that's all we could do. So what I'd like to do, again, is talk a little bit about the structure here and then start to implement some things so that we can have a more coherent concept of how we might deal with interaction in the debug system. And we won't go too far with it because, again, it's really not going to be something that's going to be in the game. So we don't... It's probably not even something that I might even spend any time on in reality here, but because this is an educational stream, I thought it was a good opportunity to talk about this a little bit. And I think it's something people should kind of have a reasonable understanding of, right? So here we are. Here's day 196. And this is sort of UI input processing. All right. So you've seen me do some very rudimentary input processing. And it's the kind of input processing that a lot of people associated with the I am GUI style stuff, right? Which I am constantly asked about. And in general, what I mean by the type of thing people associate with it is they often associate I am GUI style processing with like single execution model, I guess I would say, right? And what that means is if I have something like a checkbox and I've got a thing next to that checkbox, and what I'm going to do with this checkbox is I click on the checkbox and it checks it, and I click on it again and it like unchecks it or something like that, right? That's the interaction model I have. Then typically what ends up happening is in I am GUI, you will see something where they'll do like, you know, or they won't even do if checkbox. I guess if it's a checkbox, they'll just call checkbox, right? And then inside this checkbox routine, it will do something where it decides, you know, is the mouse in here and has it clicked? And if it has or not, it'll like toggle the check on or off, right? Then that's the most basic, the most straightforward way that you could possibly implement this thing. You know what I mean? Now, there's a problem with this way of thinking about things. And that is that it makes it rather difficult to decouple the way in which things work with, how should I say this? It makes it very difficult to decouple the interactions from the specific thing that is on the screen, right? So for example, if what I wanted to do instead was I had some kind of a selection paradigm. So I wanted to like select this thing. And maybe I had like a toolbox over here that was like my checkbox tool, and I had my selection arrow tool. And if I was on the arrow tool, when I clicked on this, it should select it. And when I had my checkbox tool, right, I wanted to like check it or whatever, you know? Then what that means is every possible tool that I might want to implement or every possible behavior that I might want to implement has to get stuffed inside this checkbox routine. Which means that the person who implements the checkbox routine has to be the person who knows everything that might ever actually occur here, right? Because the interaction cannot be written outside of the thing that it actually, outside of this actual call. Everything kind of has to happen inside there, right? And so I just wanted to point that out. That is sort of the thing that you've seen me do so far. And I don't consider that I am GUI at all. I just consider that to be one very simple way of implementing interaction processing that really has nothing to do with whether you're immediate mode or not. And specifically, the reason that I say that is because I am GUI, the immediate mode part of I am GUI, is only talking about the fact that these things are announced by the code, and it does not talk about the fact that the thing that is announced had to be checkbox, right? Instead, what could have been announced here was some generic thing that's just saying, like, I have a Boolean, right? It has this information about it. And I'm not going to say anything about how I want you to process it as a UI element. I may just be putting these things into a batch, right, as part of the IAM pass-through that buffers up all the information about what ended up on the screen. And then it could have a totally separate set of code where people have implemented different tools, which will then scan through this batch and do things, right? Because there's nothing inherent about the immediate mode nature of the UI that requires you to not do this, right? The immediate mode nature is just about the fact that the calling code, it doesn't have to save like a pointer. It doesn't have to call a create function to create some kind of a widget. It just announces the things that it has. And it just does them in a pass and it's done. Now, what it announces, on the other hand, is totally up to it. And again, that's one of the big reasons I say, like, most people don't seem to conceptualize I am GUI the way that I had intended. Not that I really care, but that's just part of it. So what I'm going to kind of show here as we develop our debug UI a little bit more, I'm going to try to show you a little bit of how you might structure your code in such a way as to avoid this kind of a thing, just because I'm assuming that everyone could find reference to how you do this, and I've already shown how to do it a little bit in the code. So for example, if we go into here to Handmade debug, oops. So, we've got a pretty obvious situation here. This is an example. We've got these debug profile things on the screen that we had been printing out. And if you press the left mouse button, it would just take whichever one you were over, right? And it would do an operation on that, right? Does that make sense? And so if you look at how this code is structured, it's very immediate mode, meaning this thing right here goes through all the counters. It does a bunch of operations on those counters. But all it does when it does that processing is remember who it would have been interacting with, right? Like, who is the person that it's interacting with? Then at the end, at the very end, it goes, okay, now I'm going to just do whatever I want to do UI-wise, and I'm going to use whatever came out of the immediate mode pass as the information about who to do it to. And what you can see, if like what I'm trying to say, like I said kind of here when I was talking about this, what you can see there is this is totally decoupled from the part where you're actually doing that processing. The thing that knows what to do with the UI element is a completely different part of the code than the part that actually drew it on the screen and recorded the fact that it was there. And that's the way I tend to like to structure my UIs, because with that structure, it affords you a lot more possibilities for writing things that work cross UI element or in a broader sense with the UI elements than if it is baked directly into the operation at the time. Because we could have done that. Remember, I could have done what was pressed. I could have done that right here, right? Instead of storing the hot record, I could have done that right here. But I chose not to. And by comparison, I think we did it the other way in one of these other ones here. I can't remember, though. Let's see here. No, okay, guys, looks like I did it. Looks like I did it that way in both cases. I did the debug state hot variable thing here as well. All right, so that's okay. So I think it was only when we had it baked in here, which when we had it in here before. I think we did at one point. I think that was the only time that I was doing it kind of in the older, in the sort of like more direct way, which I don't super love, right? Okay. So that's the way that I'm going to continue pursuing to do things. But I'm going to take it a slight step further right now that we've got this. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a notion of the place in which these operations occur. And I'd like to have a notion of what operation is occurring so that we can make these things, like I can make things like some way to interact with those real with those like floating point variables or whatever else, right? So here's how I'm going to approach that. In here, when I do my draw debug menu, I'm going to assume, like we've sort of ad hoc done so far, I'm going to assume that what that does is that produces a piece of information for me, which is what the mouse is over at this particular time, right? And that won't necessarily be something that I will use, but it's a piece of information that I want to have. And so if I go in here and we see how this is kind of working already, I've got this hot variable thing, right? And hot variable gets set by draw debug menu. Right now what I do is I just take that hot variable, I see whether or not it was pressed, whether the mouse was pressed, and if it was, I do the operation to that hot variable. I want to, again, move like sort of one step past that and say that I have two things. I have the hot variable and I have the interacting variable, right? And I might just say this like hot interacting with, right? Something like this. And these are going to form the basis of my UI system. So the hot variable is the one that comes out of draw debug main menu. In here, it will set the hot variable, like so. And in fact, I don't even know, now that I think about it, I don't even know that I want it to set the hot variable. I think what I'd rather do is actually just have this return to me who is hot or something. Although, you know what? I guess I don't really need to do that. Let's do it this way. We'll have the hot variable, have the interact variable, and I'll put one more in here, which is like next hot. And then these guys, they just always set next hot, right? And I'm going to make this systemic. So I'm going to say at the start of our debug, at the start of everything, I clear it, like I was sort of doing here with the hot record. We then do stuff, whatever the stuff is that we're going to do. And that can set the hot record. Anyone in here can do that operation of setting the hot record, or hot variable, I guess, in this point, in this case. Right? And then at the end, we will use that information and decide what we want to do with it. Right? Okay. So here's how we're going to do that. And I guess I could also do something here where we just kind of pull this out so it's a little easier for you guys to keep track of what I'm talking about. Right? So I'm going to grab this, I'm going to put it in here, and this is just going to be like interact, debug interact, and that's going to take the debug state. There it is. Right? Nothing particular odd going on there, obviously. It's all good. So now, I clear the hot thing, always at the start. I do my interactions, whatever they are, right? And then I come back through. Interact. Debug state. And I'll pass the mouse P in as well. And I guess I'll also, well, that's all I should really need, but I'll put the input in as well. All right. So inside debug interact, at the moment we're doing this thing with the left mouse button, so we'll just leave it that way. But what I want to do here is I want to start by entertaining a few more concepts, right? So the first thing I want to know is what is the actual thing that I'm doing at this moment? Am I interacting with something or am I not? And so at the moment we'll do something a little more straightforward. In fact, you know what, I don't really want to keep dealing with this, so I'm just going to put that up there and do this. So what I would like to do, if Emacs will let me do this, there we go. What I would like to do is say, okay, first I'm going to check to see if I'm interacting with something. If I'm interacting with a variable, then that means I have a very specific thing that I'm doing at this time. And I want that interaction, whatever that interaction is, to have primacy. If I'm not interacting with a variable, right, then it's not such a big deal. That means I'm just kind of moving the mouse around and everything's fine. So if I'm just moving the mouse around and everything's fine, that implies to me that whatever the hot variable was, whatever variable I'm over, should become officially hot, if you will, right? But if I'm interacting with something, it should not be. What that then means too is once I'm in that state, I would like to say that if I start interacting with a variable, the way that that's going to happen for now is I'm going to click down on it. I'm going to push the mouse down on it, right? And so what I want to do here is I want to test to see if, I'm going to use went down as a thing. And I'm going to say, if the button went down on this frame, then I would like to start interacting with this thing. Otherwise, and I guess what I could do too here is say, I kind of want to test a couple different things. So I don't know, maybe I should actually do this a little bit more explicitly because I'd like to know a couple things. So I could say something like, if clicked, I could have a clicked thing where if it clicked down and up inside one frame by itself. Otherwise, I'd say, if it went down, right? So I kind of have two different sort of ways I could think about that. So if I clicked something or if it went down, then I've got different things I might do. I'll leave this one for now because, again, like I said, I want to kind of think about that one a little bit more. But assuming that it went down, so I just started interacting with this thing, then what I'm going to say is, okay, whatever I was interacting with, or whatever I was whatever I was hovering over, I would like that to be what I start interacting with, right? And similarly, I'd like to say, for now, again, if whatever the button is that I was interacting with there, if that went up, I would like to go ahead and say that whatever I'm interacting with will return to 0. I'm going to if zero this out for a while, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about how this works, and we're going to keep plying on this a little bit more. So first I need those utility functions that I have there. Oh, and I forgot I passed this guy a bunch of things, but I didn't actually make them exist. Let's try that again. Let's go ahead and get our game input and our mouse speed and get rid of semicolon. All right. And so what I'd like to do here is, I guess for went up, all I really need to know is if it ended down. Right? If it didn't end down, then we're not interacting anymore. Went down, I guess, is really simple too. That's just did it end down. And so clicked, all I really need to know for clicked, I suppose, is if the half transition count is greater than 1. You know, handle clicks inside a frame, like so. All right. So what must have wait is why? There we go. I don't know why I left that in there, but I did. So if this is the logic for our button, I'm going to make a little bit way for we can draw it so we can see it. I could actually, I suppose, just also print this out. I could just make this be a piece of debug text that we use. So I could do something like this. I don't know if this actually will work. I don't remember if we actually finished this stuff. We didn't really integrate it into our current thing. I think it's debug text line. Yeah. If I do a debug text line, can I actually see what's happening here? Interacting. Oops. Like so. And not. All right. So let's see what happens there. Yeah, because I can see that right there. So there it is. So if the mouse goes down, you can kind of see how it becomes interacting, right? And as I move it around, there it goes. And then when I let go, it comes off, right? Like so. All right. So now that I've got that, I want to go ahead and make the most straightforward change here. I just want, when I compare like what the item color could be, you can see that I'm using is-in rectangle for that. Now, imagine, just from what you could see here, if I was to go in and want to edit one of these, and I click and drag on it, and now as I'm dragging around, it highlights all the rest of this stuff, right? You see how that's happening? I wouldn't want that to happen, right? I want this thing to stay highlighted that I'm interacting with. And so that is a classic example of the thing that I was saying that I don't want in here, which is that a decision about what should be displayed or done is being made in line with the actual immediate pass. And that's not what I want, right? What I want to do instead is the only thing that the immediate mode pass should be doing is determining the information that will be used later. So in order to draw something as being hot, I exclusively want the rendering code to test things that were set by the controlling code, by that interact thing. So I want to look to see if the variable that we're talking about here was said to be the hot variable by the actual UI interaction code, right? So basically what I've done there is I've pulled that out into the way that I said I want to do things instead of the way that we talked about before. And so if you look at what's happening here, right? Now when I interact with something, you can see that it locks that hot thing in. So now the interaction goes on as long as it goes, and only when I let go of the mouse does the hot thing stop, right? So again, just pulling that out and putting that into the interaction code so that it can be decoupled and separate in a way that allows me to iterate on it as sort of its own separate thing that doesn't require specifically being coupled to each individual drawable thing. Right? Okay. So if I continue down this path, what I would like to do now is I would like to say, okay, if the half transition count, if someone clicks on something inside a frame, you can kind of see what I've set up here. Here's the beginning of the click. Here's the end of the click. So what I'd like to do is be able to do those two things if there is a click, a whole click inside a frame. I'd like it to do both of those things, right? And so there's two ways I can do that. One way I can do that is I can just make functions, right? And maybe that's a good way to do it, so we'll try that. So we'll do something like begin interact or something, and then debug end interact, something like that. And what I can do there is say, all right, this is debug begin interact, and this up here is going to be debug end interact, like so. And then what I could say is, well, if I get a click inside one frame, then what I would like to do is I'd like to just go ahead and process them both. Right? I just want to do whatever would have happened. Now, again, this was kind of because we chose a simplified model for the way the user interface thing happened here. We could even go a little bit more hog wild, right? We could do something where we actually count down that number. We actually like go further down that number. So we know, if the thing ended down or whatever, we could sort of say, all right, however much the half transition count was, let's get it down to 0 or 1. So we could do something like this. Right? So we're going to say, this is how many times the button went up or down. We're going to say that until, as long as it's going to be above 1, I want to process a click. So if the user was like wailing on the mouse button, I'm going to process clicks, right? And then, when I've gotten to the end of that, presumably I would then want to also say, okay, now we're down to 0, 1 clicks if 0, 1 transitions. At that one transition, what I may want to do is if it ended down, go into the actual interaction there. Right? It makes sense. So that seems pretty straightforward, right? I suppose. So I could do that. The other thing that's interesting is if I was already interacting with something, maybe I want to support that case as well, right? Maybe I want to support the case where I was already interacting with something and the user's wailing on the button for some reason that we don't necessarily know what it is, right? And so I can go in there and also presumably do that, right? I could say something like, all right, I want to do this sort of a thing where I just go through like how many transitions were there, and I'll do, you could even imagine doing it this way where I don't even actually have any sort of logic to it. I could do something where I'm literally just switching the order, right? That would process all of the clicks that come through by doing ends begins instead of by doing begins ends, and then at the end it would still do the close processing. So you could do that pretty straightforward, and really it just is, yeah, it's really not that complicated. It's not particularly interesting. The other thing I suppose I could do is I could make it so that I feel like you could even collapse this a little bit more straightforwardly, right? If I just said inside the loop for every transition, I could just say, well, whatever the transition was going to be, well, no, yeah, you know what, you can't really do that. Nah, I'm going to take that back. So I could do something like that. I don't know if I really want to. I don't really know if it's really necessary. If you have a standard event system for passing things in, you could see that you just do a for loop here, and you do these inside of the for loop. But we went with a simplified system that just passes a single known state down and doesn't try to do anything more fancy with it, right? So it's hard to say. But either way, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, very much for our particular purposes, because since it's only debug code, but it's something to be aware of. All right. So yeah, if we have that, now I've got the ability to sort of know exactly what's going on here in terms of debug begins and ends interacts, right? And the other thing that I would want to know is I want to know every time the mouse moves, so after we've done all this stuff, right? Or maybe perhaps we even want to do it before. We want to assume that mouse moves happen before the click. It's up to us to decide, again, since we aren't looking at them sort of in some kind of event order that's been serialized for us. On the platform side, we kind of just go like, okay, we can do it in either order that we want. So maybe what we do here is we just say, all right, we also have debug, I guess, we could just say this is our debug movement interact right here. And so if we are at the point where we're interacting with something, if we're not interacting with anything, I don't think we really have to do anything. If we are interacting with something, we would process the mouse motion in a way that would that would do whatever that interaction is, right? And so this is basically like mouse move interaction right here. And this is like, click interaction. If that makes sense. So for the mouse move interaction, we really only need to know whether or not this thing, whatever the thing is that we're mouse moving on, is something that we would actually interact with the mouse that way. So whatever the interacting variable is, and I'll pull it out here into a more simplified name. So if we take a look at whatever the var type is, there's only one thing that we actually interact with at the moment in a way that we would drag. And that would presumably be one of those variables that was, a real 32 or an int 32 or something like that. So I'm just going to take a look at just that one. I'm going to say, okay, if we were moving the mouse, I want to interact with one of these, and I want to interact with it by changing whatever its value is, right? So I want to be able to say whatever the real 32 was, I'm going to take like some kind of mouse delta and multiply it by it. And I'm just going to pick something random here. I'm going to say 0.1 for no real reason whatsoever, and then I'm going to take whatever the mouse delta is. So I want to do like a dmouse p kind of a thing, like that. And so the first question would be, well, where do I get the dmouse p? Again, I'm going to have to difference it with the previous frame, right? So the dmouse p would be something like whatever the last mouse p was. And I would take the current mouse p, and I just look at what's the delta between those. And that's what I'm going to use, again, to drive those kinds of interactions, right? At the end of everything, I would obviously need to take whatever the debug state is. I need to remember what that last mouse p is. Whatever the last mouse p I processed was, I need to know, so in order to like figure out what I should do. So somewhere in the debug state, I'm going to have that piece of information. So again, I'll put that here with last mouse p, just so it's clear what it is. All right. Okay. So at this point, we're sort of getting a little further, but in order to get at that real value, right, I have to be able to open these guys up. So I need to implement at least one more thing, which is I need to put back in that Boolean processing for those guys, And so what I need to do is that would be an end interaction, I assume. So on interaction ends, I want to do the stuff we were doing before, which is this. So when I end the interaction, I know that I've clicked already. So what I'm going to do is say, okay, whatever the variable is that I was interacting with, which is, of course, this one. And I guess I should double check. Yeah, this should probably, so there's one other thing we should do here, and it's the next thing I was going to do. I'm trying to think, yeah, I'll have 50 minutes plus 10. I got plenty of time. Okay, cool. So I'm going to do it this way first, and then show you, and then switch it up a little bit in a second. Okay, so when I'm going to end the interaction, I'm just going to look to see if I had an interacting variable, right? And assuming that I did have an interacting variable, I'm going to get it out. I'm going to look at what type it is and do whatever the thing is that I want to do on that type. Then I'm going to clear it so we know we're not interacting with it anymore. Okay. So off we go. And I should now be able to open things up, which I can, right? You can see me doing it there. And now I'm going to see about interacting with one of these guys. So I'd like to sort of change that variable. Oh, right. And I should probably allow our debug end interact to allow things to pass through that now don't need to be interacted with. Oops. Yeah, okay. Otherwise, it's going to keep complaining. So yeah, if I open up the camera here, now we can kind of see I can edit this value, right? Like so. I probably shouldn't have tied it to the Y. I probably should have tied it to the X. because it's kind of a little bit stupid, I suppose, the way that I did it. But hey, we got what we wanted anyway, which is that we can edit our debug camera and zoom it in and out. And you can see that we have the problem that I was talking about before, which is why I was saying I think we probably want to make some system that allows this to not have to be compiled like it is currently, because that compile step, by the time Visual Studio is done compiling, we're waiting a long time. And it would be nice for that value to just update in real time, right? Because there's no reason why we couldn't do that. So I think at some point we probably should do that. But now we've got the ability to modify these debug variables, and it's pretty straightforward, right? So that's all good. So let's take this a little bit further and look at this a little bit more closely. So right now, there is a little bit of an odd thing, which is that if I were to click down out here, right? So I've clicked the mouse down, and now I move up. Now you'll notice that things get kind of a little bit strange, right? It's kind of unusual what happens. And the reason, right, is because we are not able to go into an interacting state if we are interacting with nothing. So when I click down out here, it's like, okay, the hot variable was 0, so the interacting with is still 0. And so it doesn't consider it having started interaction, but I really did. If I click down here and drag, I should not then start interacting with the very first thing I hit, which is what happens. Like imagine if I do this, right? You see how I picked that up? By just like rolling into it with the drag. So what I want to do is I want to have some way of having my interactions be a state separate from storing what is actually being interacted with, right? And so in order to do that, I'm going to want to introduce some kind of a notion of a interaction state that's separate from whatever else I might be doing. So in order to do that, I'm going to use an enum. You could also use a callback for this, depending on how you want to do it. In other words, I could do a type def here for a function. I'm going to do, I think I'm going to stick with an enum for now. This really 6 of one, half dozen of the other, and I tend to prefer enums over callbacks most of the time. So I'm just going to do like debug interaction, drag value, and debug interaction. Let's go a little hog wild here. Let's go nuts. Let's say we have debug interaction, drag value, and let's also say we have debug interaction. Well, toggle value maybe. I don't know. And debug interaction tear. Something like that. So I'm just making some things up here. And we'll have debug interaction none. And now I have some notion of what's going on in terms of interaction. And so what I can do here is I can kind of reverse the way that I've set this up. And I can say something like, all right, I want to know what I'm doing right now. So I want to know what it is that the code is, how the code is interacting. So I'm going to set up a thing here where I just say I've got a debug interaction, and this is my interaction. I'm going to look at that interaction and say, if I am actually interacting at this time, I'm going to do one thing. Oops. And if I'm not, I'm going to do another. And so that keeps it roughly the same way that we were doing it before, meaning the else clause is the clause for when I'm not interacting at the moment, but I might go into an interaction. And you can see, that sort of doesn't change anything here. And I'll go ahead and delete these. We don't really care about this at the moment. Then up here, if I am interacting, meaning I have a it's non-none, then I have various things that I might be doing. So what I want to do now is I actually want to do, these will end up being sort of double switches, right? These will basically be, I've got some set of things I might do where I want to switch on whatever the interaction is that I'm doing, whatever the interactor is, right? So I'm just going to, I'm going to switch on this interaction. And I suppose now that I think about it, really, I don't need the if anymore. I suppose that was premature to say that I should keep that. I don't really need to keep that, right? I can switch on the interaction. I can have the case of debug interaction none. That's just what I've got down here, right? That's what happens. And then I can also have the rest of my values happening here. All right. Now, if I'm dragging a value, then the only thing that I really know how to do is just do this particular type, which is real 32 at the moment, so that's fine. But let's continue on porting the rest of this stuff. So, assuming that I have an interaction none, I might want to change my interaction, and begin interact or end interact will deal with that, obviously. Assuming that I was trying to toggle a value or something like that, again, I kind of want this click interaction thing to be shared. I don't really want to have to keep doing it. That's sort of why I was saying I would like them to kind of be common. It's such a hard choice. It's such a hard choice, really. I'm going to go back to keeping it the way it was, because I want these guys to be shared processing, and I don't want to have to duplicate them for every time. So, like I was saying, my first thought when I said it was premature, I was premature to call it premature. Let's be honest, because I do actually want it this way. So I would like to be able to say, like, okay, I know that I'm doing an interaction, so now there's just some code in the movement thing that says what I'm going to do in that case, right? And that's, you know, that's how that goes. So then I've got one in here, which when we're doing the drag value, it does that. The rest of these guys don't actually care. In fact, I could almost say that they don't actually do anything at the moment. And then I've got sort of the other things that might happen at the end of that interaction at the moment. Something like this. Then what I'd like to do out here is say, like, okay, when I do my begin interact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take a look at what the variable is. I'm going to decide what I would like to do interaction-wise. So I will take whoever I'm doing the interacting with, and then I will also go ahead and take a look at its type. And I'll see what kind of interaction I think that I should do. And so looking at these guys, right, I know how to interact with only a very limited number of these. So I know how to interact with a bool 32, I know how to interact with a real 32, but at the moment I don't really know how to interact with, oh, and a group. At the moment I don't really know how to interact with anybody else, right? I don't have any idea. So if I do one of these guys, then what I would do is say, okay, and you know what I could also say here? I could also say that interacting with only gets set in the case where the interacting with type is known. So I could do something like this where I say, okay, if debug state interaction, then I set it. Right? Otherwise I don't. Something like that. So for the bool case, I want to do a toggle value. That's the interaction we want. For the real case, I want to do a drag value. And I suppose in the group case, I would also want to be a toggle. Now I could call this a different interaction, but at the moment, we know they basically mean the same thing, right? So when we do the end interaction, again, same thing. I would want to basically say, well, what kind of interaction am I doing? So I would say, you know, and I would also assert that this is true, because if I'm interacting, I better have one of these now. So I'm going to say whatever the interaction is, and I can still do this part, I guess. Whatever the interaction is, I want to do a different thing depending on the circumstance. So here's a case. Here's a case. And here's a case. And so if I'm doing a drag, there's nothing that I have to do at the moment. So in a sense, we could get rid of that one. If it's a toggle, then I know I want to look at which type the variable is and toggle it. Yeah. Basically, that's about it. Tear value we haven't gotten to yet, so we'll talk about that in a second. Right? Okay. So, off we go. Or not. What did I do wrong? Did I set the debug interaction incorrectly? debug interaction, hot type, debug and interacting with, because it asserted and said I did not have an interacting with variable. So somebody cleared my interacting with in a way that, oh, duh. I also have to set it back to none at the end of this, right? Okay. There we go. All right, so in theory, we're sort of back to exactly where we were before, and we can still do the same stuff that we were doing, and off we go, right? But now, when I interact with things in theory, right in the middle of my sentence even, obviously we still need to check to make sure we actually have a variable. Otherwise, it's not going to go well. Okay, there we go. One more time. So now, what I was trying to say is, now that we have the notion of what interaction we're actually doing, then if we click outside and move in, we should be able to avoid this sort of thing now, right? You can kind of see like it moves on here and off you go, right? So what I want to do is I want to make it so that we have the ability to specify interaction. So what I'd like to do is specify some kind of interaction that's just not doing anything. Like the person clicked outside and they're, you know, they're just screwing around, I guess, or something like that. And we could do that in a couple different ways. We could make it legal for one of our values to be something that you do, right? Like I could make it legal to drag a null or something if I wanted to. But I'll just make something that's like, you know, I'll just make an actual type for it, I think is what I'll do. So when you begin interacting here, what I'm going to say is like if it wasn't a hot variable, then what I'll say is like, you know, the debug state interaction equals some kind of like, you know, no op, right? It's just like it doesn't do anything. And then in here, when we come through, I'll just do something like, okay, that's some kind of special case thing when the interaction is a no op. Oops. We'll just get rid of that. It doesn't have to do any of this stuff. It doesn't have to rewrite the config file. It doesn't have to do anything. So now I can have that happen, and when they do that, it just doesn't do anything. And then when they let go, it starts going again, right? So I'm moving it out, and it doesn't happen, like so, and then I let go, and back it goes, right? Okay. So that's, again, pretty straightforward. Nothing particularly weird there. Everything works back the way we planned it, and the highlighting works as well, and all that other good stuff too, right? But now I want to do a slightly different thing. I would like to be able to have other ways of interacting with the same piece of information, right? And I think I had about 10 minutes on the clock, so I'm going to go to 1810. So what I'd like to do is make a way to like clone a menu item or something like this, right? And so what I'm going to do something kind of a little bit weird, right? But you know, I like doing things that are kind of a little bit weird. So I'm going to make the concept of a group. I'm going to expand that a little bit. I'm just going to say that, you know, the debug variable group can maybe be in a location, right? Like I can have a place, you know? A place where that exists, right? So it's like it's UIP, right? It's where it is in the world, on the screen, if you will. And so if we talk about where a variable group is on the screen, then what I'm going to say is, okay, you know, if this variable group, and I guess to be fair, maybe I should make it so that that's sort of more of a first-class citizen. You know, maybe I want to do something more like struct debug variable, like it's because the groups kind of get nested inside each other. I want to talk about like a debug variable sort of collection, something that's like a hierarchy, right? A whole hierarchy, right? And what that is that's the root group. You know what I mean? For this thing, and the location at which that is drawn. And there'll probably be some other things eventually, right, that we would put in there. And so what I'll do is I'll just change this so that we have some bigger notion of what's going on there. Oops. Like maybe now, also in here, I would do something like, okay, whatever the debug variable hierarchy is, you know, that thing in and of itself maybe we can have as many of those as we want or something. I'm not sure exactly how we'd want to do it. But for the moment, I'll just say we've got one of those, right? Like that. And we'll just say like, okay, the state hierarchy root group equals the context root group. But then we also give it a UIP, hierarchy UIP, like so. And that's going to be wherever it was that we were drawing this. So it's like, it's this stuff, right? And I think we might want to do that outside of debug create variables. Let's see here. Oops. Handmade debug. And you know, I could still, to be honest with you, I could still do something where I did something more like this. I could still leave the debug group in there, which seems like okay. Like here's the root group, and maybe the root group is just something that always has everything in it. And then everything else we kind of play with separately, something like that. Yeah, I could see that. So we'll do it this way. All right. So after we create these variables, let's see here, create variables. Then I'm going to do some stuff where we sort of set this group up a little bit more. I don't remember where we actually set left edge. Yeah, we set it up in here. Which, to be honest, I'm not sure why we always set it up in there. That's kind of odd, but doesn't matter. Anyway, so that's where we set it up. So I'm just going to go ahead and use it there. So left edge and debug state at y are the two things I actually need to know to set up my hierarchy. So the hierarchy, this guy, I know that the group is just going to be the root group. And I know that the location is just going to be what we already computed, right? And then when I actually draw this thing, I'm going to just draw it, you know, let's see where we got handmade config, draw debug menu, there it is. Instead of passing this thing, or instead of this thing using the root group, instead this thing is going to use that hierarchy, right? So it'll do hierarchy group first child, like so. And for the at x at y, it'll use the UIP. Like so. That's a good point. Doesn't. Okay. And so now we should get the exact same thing. Or not. Did I not initialize that properly? I'm just trying to do exactly, like literally, the exact same thing I was doing before. And I set the group and the UIP. I set them to the at y in the left edge, which should have been correct. And the root group should still be initialized unless I maybe did something stupid there, which could be the case. Let's double check. Variables. There we go. So yeah, I still set that group, so I'm not sure what was the problem there. Why am I not seeing anybody? Where did everybody go? I guess we can find out by stepping in. Let's find out where everybody went. Debug, draw, main, menu. Am I never calling this function? Let's see here. I am calling the function, so set breakpoint Where is code for breakpoint? No. 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 Almost there. Okay. That's what I want. So let's see what these values are and why I'm not seeing what I want to see. At x, at y. Those seem reasonable. Var is a group, ground chunks. Is there something not reasonable about oh. Oh dear. Did I flip the two? Did I do something really bright there? Somehow? Yep. Gotta love it. Well, that explains that. That was anticlimactic, to say the least. Okay. So I want to stop now because I'll do the rest tomorrow, but I just wanted to make sure that we could draw two of those. And so, for example, you know, if we wanted to draw more than one of them now, we can just have multiple hierarchies and draw them. So tomorrow I can implement another debug function, which is just to be able to like tear off one of the menu items and put it somewhere else, for example, which is just kind of a handy thing to be able to do. And just kind of we'll start to show a little bit more about how to manage the interaction stuff. But we have a little bit more ways to go on that. So yeah, so at the moment, we'll just have to hold off on that and leave it till tomorrow. For now, let's go to the Q&A. Anyone who has a Q, please push a Q colon in front of it, and I will do A. I will A it. I just want food. Once you finish making the game, you do a live playthrough. Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that actually while we are making the game, we will be doing a bunch of playing through it as well, right? Because, I mean, we're getting towards the end of the code we can do that doesn't involve playing the game, right? We've got a few lighting things to do and maybe a little collision detection stuff to do. But after that, pretty much everything we do is going to involve playing the game because, you know, right after that, we're into world gen. And at that point, you know, we got to walk around the world and start playing with things in the world. And, you know, we can't really do anything without interacting with the game. So we're going to be at a point where we're pretty much going to have to be playing the game all the time. And, you know, we'll try to keep it to a minimum on stream, in the sense that I don't want to be sitting around playing around all the time. And to be honest, I don't really know quite how to manage that well. I mean, I'll try to do the best I can because it's been relatively easy for us since we've been working on code that's primarily structural and like architectural implementation-wise. It's been pretty easy to keep it so that we don't have to do a lot of like running the game to work with it. And I don't know, so I'm hoping that maybe using the loop live code editing that we implemented, you know, we'll because you don't want the stream to just turn into me just basically having to play the game a ton to get to various places and say, okay, maybe we should try this one thing, and then there's like 5 seconds of programming. So I'm hoping that maybe, you know, I don't know. This Isaac, we're getting close to 200 episodes. How long do you think until you start on the game proper? I don't know. Like I said, I thought 200 days was a pretty good estimate, or I should say 200 hours or whatever was a pretty good estimate. And I don't think we'll be that far from that. I think we're going to go over it by a bit because I want to do some lighting. And see that list. No, where is my list? Where is the list? So yeah, I think, you know, I've got a little more stuff I want to do in here. You know, we're doing this part now. We did this part. We did this part. But we've got GUI, the diagramming and the GUI stuff we haven't finished, so we got to do that. This is just a single debugging thing, so I don't think that would take very long. Particle systems we actually did, although we didn't do, maybe everything we could have done with, but we actually already did them. So really it would just be if we did something in the renderer. So really this is mostly what we're looking at here. And then I think after that, I feel like we'll have to do, I feel like everything else is gamey. There's nothing else really in here that I can do without being gamey. Like we can't write a save game system. I guess we could do this. Multiple sim regions. Well, but even that I can't really do. Until I actually have a bunch of entities interacting, I wouldn't feel comfortable probably implementing this. So I would say probably what we would do is start in on constructing, basically to do these two right here. We would start in constructing a few gameplay pieces to nail down how we want the collision detector and the Z stuff to work. Yeah, I don't really see anything else in here that we can do without game stuff. I mean, even something like pathfinding, I wouldn't feel comfortable actually implementing pathfinding prior to having the game be gamey. So yeah. So I would say pretty much just the stuff up here. This stuff is all going to require game to be gamey. We won't go hog wild. So, I feel like we want to still nail down a bunch of these things to a greater extent before we start like cranking out entities, like just doing and before we're right here where we're like, okay, we're not thinking ever about the collision detection anymore for the most part or something like that. But I don't even really know that because it may be that we're constantly kind of going back and forth a little bit. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that basically like the only things that we could finish before gamifying things is up above here. Does this mean a proper RNG is around the corner? Probably not around the corner because I don't think, like I said, I probably wouldn't try doing too much world gen, which is where we care about the RNG, before we have like a few rooms of gameplay working well, right? So I feel like we're still gonna do this part first when we come in here. Probably not this. Like this part is probably more like that, right? But we're probably going to do this first, which would be like, guy and some enemies in a couple rooms fighting and things like this, right? So this part, I feel like, does not have any RNG-ness to it, for the most part. So it would probably be like that, and then, yeah, maybe, I would actually say this probably, if we're being realistic, looks like this. Because the entity system, and I don't really know why some of this stuff was laid out the way it was. I feel like it probably looks more like this. Maybe. Like that's probably a little more realistic. That'd be my guess. It's funny that we said animation would lead into rendering, but we did the renderer first. So that's not true. But yeah. Also don't know what stars are. So yeah. I would say that is maybe a little bit more realistic in terms of how things would probably go. But I don't know. Like I said, it could go either way. It's possible that this could go up here. Games are very hard to predict schedule-wise, especially if you're the only programmer on them, so I don't really know. LQ144, did I already cover the Minkowski difference on the stream? I don't remember. When we talked about the collision detection, I definitely did talk about the Minkowski sum. I mean, there really is no thing as a Minkowski difference. There's a Minkowski addition of the inverse or whatever. And I don't remember how much I covered of that. We covered enough to do growing shapes by other shapes, which is a Minkowski sum. And I don't really know if I talked about the difference. I don't think I would have, because the only reason you talk about the Minkowski difference in the sense of like subtracting a shape from another, or summing the inverse, summing the negative. The only reason you'd probably talk about that is if you were trying to find the origin for like a GJK kind of a thing, and we didn't talk about that. So, could you explain the difference between how our IMGUI is often implemented and how you think it should work again? It went a bit fast for me. So this is just one of the things, one of the many things. But like one way is the way that I wrote it here in the debug one, right? Which is to say that the interaction code is separate from the pass that does the drawing. So these are like out here. This is the drawing, right? Debug drawing menu. It doesn't do any interaction itself. Instead, all of the interaction is deferred to later by using the hit testing that happened in the IM pass. Later on, somebody will actually do the interactions. And basically, it's splitting those two things apart that I think was the part that I was trying to talk about. So we could have shoved these in there, right? We could have shoved these directly into here. When we do our is in rectangle, we could have done it here. And I just don't think that's a very good place to do it, because I feel like it makes it harder to decouple and it's harder to keep the code organized with the parts of the code that you want it to be organized with. It's, in some sense, it's just a stupid artifact of the way that procedural stuff works. But I just find that I like to pull those two things out. But that was the only part I was trying to elaborate on. Let's see. Saber173, would you ever consider doing a 24-hour stream that was create X app or game from start to finish in one stream? I mean, I guess it's not that I wouldn't consider it. It's more that I'm not really sure what would be the point of it. So, I mean, I would probably consider it and then go, that doesn't sound like a very good idea. I don't know. I mean, like, I just don't know what would be gained by doing this. Unless it was like, like a publicity stunt or something, I suppose, where you're just like, 24 hours, can you create this in that time or something? Not really seeing any more questions, so I guess we are done. All right. Let's see. Let's go ahead and see. Close, please. Okay, thank you everyone for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you want to follow along at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, and it comes with the source code so that you can follow along with what we're doing, and if you want to play around with it, that's a good way to do it. We also have a Patreon page if you want to support the video series. We have a forum site you can go to ask questions, get an annotated episode guide, and a tweet bot, which tweets the schedule at you if you're trying to get to stream live. And if you are trying to get to stream live, you can do that tomorrow again at 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. I will be back here, and I'm going to make a little thing so we can tear off menu items. Again, just to kind of show how to do like different interactions in one place and that sort of thing. And then after that, I think we may be kind of done with that part of things. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and move on to a couple of our to-dos here. Maybe get the things working, updating in real time, and then integrate in our little profile logging system so that we can, get all the UI in one place and be able to kind of maybe start to use that to interact with and scrub through our debug events, which I think would be nice. So just kind of start to pull things together now that I've shown all the different parts of it. Try to start to pull those things together so that we can kind of wrap up the debug system and be relatively happy with where it's at in terms of, having something we can use during the stream to debug stuff when we have stuff we need to debug, or tweak things that we need to tweak. So that's about it. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you guys here tomorrow. Until next time, have fun programming, and I will see you on the internet.